Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming today for the second day of Mobile Era. Please feel welcomed. And yes, we don't have that much to say today, so everything continues like yesterday. Talks all day long. I hope you will get inspired, learn something new. And today our first talk is a talk from Lockwood about the layout and his new framework, which you can find on the GitHub. And yes, please welcome and give a heads.
So my name is Nick. I work at a company called Schibsted, and for the last 8 months or so, probably, I've been working on a framework called Layout. So I'll tell you why we built Layout, and then I'll tell you what it is. So native UI is pretty difficult. I'd say it's harder than doing web UI, probably. Why? We have to deal with multiple device sizes, multiple languages and locales, and the design tools that our designers use are not very much like the development tools. You know, they give us a sketch file, and we pretty much have to build everything again from scratch. We can't kind of reuse the designs that they've given us directly. So the solution that Apple gives us for building UI is currently storyboards and auto layout. And when we started building our product a couple of years ago, we wanted to use Apple's standard solution. We started enthusiastically with a big storyboard, everything with auto layout constraints, and pretty rapidly we found that stopped working for us. It didn't really scale for what we were trying to build. So what's up with storyboards? So there's a lot of good things about storyboards. They're WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, kind of. So for the most part, you can design your UI with drag and drop. But if you try and do anything complicated like a collection view or dynamic data, it pretty rapidly gets to the point where what you're seeing in the storyboard is not actually what you're going to see on screen in your app. They're declarative. What do I mean by that? So you're not writing code to do your layout. It's not something that has to be executed procedurally. It's you say, I want these things to be here, and that's where they go. And that's kind of generally considered to be a good thing in computer science these days. They're data, not code, so they can be serialized to a file and deserialized again. Theoretically, you could send them over a network, although in practice nobody does that because of other reasons I'll get to in a minute. And there's a rapid sort of edit and test cycle. So, you make your changes and you see them immediately, as long as there's something that can be shown in the storyboard in Interface Builder. What's bad about them? They're an opaque proprietary format, so Apple doesn't really provide any documentation. I mean, they are technically XML, but if anybody's tried to read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And why is that a problem? Well, you can't really code review somebody's changes to a storyboard. You can see that they've changed some things in GitHub, but you have no idea what effect that's had. And that makes it hard to collaborate. So, if two different people make changes to a storyboard file at the same time and you try and merge them, it's pretty much just luck whether you end up with something that's comprehensible or usable. As I said, you can't really review them. And the bigger your team is, the more difficult that becomes to work with. They offer limited reusability. So, if you have the same button on two different screens in a storyboard, you're pretty much just going to copy and paste it. Like, that's the only way to reuse that, really. You can reuse things at the level of a view controller with view controller containment, but you don't want to have a separate view controller for every button. That doesn't make sense. They're hard to refactor. So, if you make sweeping changes to a storyboard, you quite often end up just deleting it and starting again because trying to move views around with all of their auto layout constraints is really hard. And it's hard to inject constants. So if you have colors, fonts, standard metrics, maybe you've come up with a design scheme where everything has to be padded by 15 pixels. There's no way to use those as constants in your storyboard, right? You're just going to retype that value, copy and paste those values over and over and over again. And this comes back to the refactoring point, that if you then decide, actually, we want it to be 20 pixels, well, that's going to be find and replace. That's the only way you're going to change that. If you miss one, the compiler's not going to tell you. So what are the alternatives to storyboards? Well, the obvious answer is doing all of your layout in code. that's not great. That's not a pleasant experience. You can't really understand what's going on if you look at a bunch of code that defines frames or auto layout constraints. You have to run it to see what's going on there. And that code's going to have a lot of magic numbers in it probably as well. It rapidly gets out of hand. Or you can use a third-party tool. An extreme example would be React Native. Just use a completely different system to build your UI. We didn't want to go that route. We wanted to try and stick with Swift. We like Swift. We like Apple's tools generally. So what's up with auto layout? So if you're doing auto layout in code, as opposed to in storyboards, it is good. It has some good qualities. So it's again declarative. You're not writing like a layout subviews function with a bunch of code that has to be executed in a particular order. And it's powerful, so it can handle a lot of things that the old auto-resizing mask system couldn't handle. Things like dynamic text sizing, something that's very difficult to work with when you're dealing with frames. What's bad? It's very complicated. I find it complicated, and I've been using it for years. It's potentially slow, so the auto layout algorithm is kind of recursive and not really defined. So you can have layouts which can sort of take an arbitrarily long time to be resolved. And it's hard to reason about. So auto layout uses a weighting system where you say, okay, the width of this element is 10 pixels, and also the width of this element is 20 pixels. How's that possible? Well, because they have different weights, and it will just kind of work out what you meant. That can be very difficult to sort of anticipate. And you often see that Apple gets it wrong. You see weird errors in iOS all the time where something's the wrong size or some text is clipped. And it's hard to change again. So, particularly in a storyboard, if you have a bunch of constraints and you need to add an extra view somewhere in the middle of some other views that are all connected to each other, you're probably just going to delete your constraints and start again. Like trying to work out what's going on there is really hard. So I always like this quote by Alan Kay that simple things should be simple and complex things should be possible. So this is a principle for the design of an API. If you're trying to do something really simple, that should be very easy. If you're trying to do something complicated, it can't necessarily be easy, but it should at least be possible. So how well does auto layout stack up against this? I don't expect you to read this code. It's more about the quantity of it. So this is the auto layout code required to just make a view match the size of its container. It's a pretty basic requirement, and that's quite a lot of code. You compare that to the old auto-resizing masks approach, and that's a lot simpler. Something more complicated, so we've got two views here, two labels, hello and world, and we want to space them 10 points apart. And of course, we don't know how big they are because your font could be arbitrarily large. So this is a kind of semi-complicated thing. And auto layout, I mean, it's still a lot of code, but I'd say that it's kind of about how much you'd expect. And it's not, it's not considerably simpler to do that with auto-resizing masks or frames. And note that this code, unlike the auto layout code, is not declarative. We're calling the size to fit function here, so this is procedural, and it depends on like a bunch of things. Like it won't work if maybe the view hasn't been created yet, or hasn't been set to the right size, or the parent view hasn't been set. Layout margins.top might be 0 because we're trying to execute this too early. So this approach has a lot of disadvantages over the auto layout, but it's still we're still talking about quite complicated code to do this with auto layout. I'd say that auto layout is basically, simple things are complicated and complicated things are complicated. So what are the alternatives? There's visual formatting language, which is a kind of a DSL for auto layout. That's reasonably nice. I think it still has some problems. There's a bunch of auto layout DSLs. What do I mean by DSLs? These are basically Swift libraries that give you an alternative syntax for auto layout. And there's some pretty good ones out there. We've come up with another solution, which is expressions. And expressions is a library that's a kind of dependency of the layout framework that I've been working on. So expressions are runtime-evaluated code, but they don't use JavaScript or any kind of garbage-collected language. And I'm going to demo for you. Oops. Okay, so this is a bog standard, new project created in Xcode. The only things that I've changed from the standard single view template is I've added the layout framework, and I've changed my view controller to a layout view controller. And what I'm going to do is load a layout file. Hopefully that works. Oh dear. This is always going to happen when you do live code demos. Okay, so this actually was expected. So I've loaded an XML file, but it's empty, so we're not seeing anything on the screen. So now I'm going to edit that and put some content in. So you can edit your XML directly inside Xcode, but Xcode is not a particularly good XML editor. It doesn't have any kind of autocomplete for layout, so I'm going to use Sublime Text instead, which you may be familiar with. Okay, let's just line these up a bit. Okay, so now I'm not using any kind of snippets here, which probably would have been a good idea, but I wanted to kind of show the development process as it actually is, rather than a sanitized version. So the reason I'm using Sublime Text is because I've created a sort of autocomplete file for Sublime Text that knows the names of standard UI views, which makes this a little bit nicer to work with. Let's try that. Oh yeah. Okay, that's not working. Why is that not working? I seem to have an alias to a different hello XML file. That's really helpful. Okay, we'll try this again. All right, so I've added my label. That's not centered, which doesn't look great. So, see. Okay, so you get the idea. And this is a dynamic layout. So I'd like to show you the silky smooth animation, but this is Xcode 9, so the simulator isn't that smooth. But you get the idea. So this is a dynamically positioned. It's not procedural code that I have to re-execute. And I don't know if you noticed there, but I didn't have to rebuild the app, except that one time when I was editing the wrong file. So you can make changes live to this XML and then just reload the content in the simulator directly. I've actually got a keyboard shortcut, Command R, which you can run in the simulator, as opposed to an Xcode, which just reloads your XML. And that's a serverless system. It just reloads the file directly from your file system. It finds the correct XML file in your project based on its name. So you don't have to run like a background process or a node server or something like that. It just kind of works locally for development. Obviously, that doesn't work on a device because the device can't see your Mac's file system. So let's make this example a little bit more interesting. Well, first of all, this code is kind of messy. So I've got a little program called layout tool, which can reformat this for us. Okay, so that looks a bit better. Right, so let's make the font a bit bigger. Okay, and let's add a little bit more interactivity to this as well. So I'm going to add a text field. Nice. Oh, you can't actually see that because I suspect it's white on a white background. Let's just change the background color. Sorry, I'm making a surprisingly large number of typos today. That's an English thing. Right. Okay. So our text field, okay, maybe it's transparent on a white background. That's even more helpful. So there is like a standard style property for text fields. I can never remember what it is. So I'm just going to take a guess and see what happens. So hopefully you can see here. So it's understood that that's not a valid property for text field, but it had a guess at what I might have meant as a sort of helpful hint here. And this is kind of to make up for the fact that we don't really get autocomplete properly. Instead of autocomplete, you get helpful errors. So because I can make these changes immediately without reloading, this is actually a pretty fast way to figure out like what I meant. Oops. Okay, that looks better. All right, so width equals 80%. Left equals 20%. Okay, my maths is not good today. Yeah, okay. Again, this is dynamic, right? So it changes as you reload. Right. Can you make that out? Okay, that's a bit better. So as you can see, you can use any property of UI view, and you can even dig in and use layer properties directly. Okay, so I'm just going to add a button, and then I think we're done with the UI. So as you can see, this isn't using auto layout. It's basically, the positioning is done in much the same way you do in layout subviews, but these expressions are evaluated dynamically at runtime. So in a sense, it's still declarative code rather than procedural. All of these expressions are effectively pure functions, and they're reevaluated whenever they need to be. They have no side effects, so the system just decides to rerun them when it thinks the layout needs to change. So, I mean, this is very similar to what you'd do in auto layout. You'd say, okay, I want the top anchor to be equal to the previous control's bottom anchor plus some constant. But because this is kind of an arbitrary expression, you can do sort of more sophisticated stuff. You can do like min and max. You don't need to jump through some of the hoops that auto layout makes you jump through with sort of having two contradictory constraints with weights that battle against each other. So So I could probably spend all day making this look nice. Okay, so here's a neat trick. So like in auto layout, components know how to size themselves to the sort of the correct size automatically. And so there's a sort of virtual constant you can use called auto for the width and height properties, which basically means whatever size you think you ought to be. So it kind of maps to intrinsic content size under the hood. So you can do things like say that the width equals auto plus 20, which means it's basically the width it wants to be plus 20 points. Okay, that looks good. Well, not good, but not terrible. Okay, so in order to actually make this interactive, I'm going to need to write some actual code, and that's done in Swift. Maybe in future the layout expressions will be more powerful, but right now business logic still lives in the view controller and it's still written in Swift. So you'd do that in pretty much the same way you would do if you were using a storyboard. So I'm going to create some outlets. And I need one for my label. And one for the text field. And I'm going to need an IB action for my button as well. And that will say something like label.text equals text field.text. I think that should work. So I'm going to need to recompile now. And then back in my XML, so I need to bind the UI label to my outlet, and I can just say outlet equals label. Now again, a nice feature, if I mistype that, it should warn me. And unlike, say, with a storyboard, where that would only probably crash when you actually try to access the control, with layout, it scans everything at the point when it loads the template. So if there's any typos, if you've got any non-existent variables or outlets or actions, it's going to find those right away. So the same with my UI button, and my text field. What did I call it? Text field. So there is actually no touch-up inside property on a button, but the way that actions are normally bound in code, which is a method, isn't really usable in XML, so I've created virtual properties for all the standard actions. So, again, I don't need to reload Xcode at this point, just the template. Hopefully, that works. Okay. So this isn't still very sophisticated. One of the problems with this code now is that it's very procedural code, I guess. Like, you've got the code is accessing individual views in the layout and making changes to them. This isn't really like, the modern way of doing things. Like, these days we like to have sort of top-down data flow. React has kind of taught the world a different way of doing things. So some of that concept is exposed in layout. Instead of going in and manipulating the text field and, manipulating the label directly, it would be nicer if the template had some concept of what data should be bound there. So what I'm going to do is delete my label outlet, and instead I'm going to add some state. And change my submit action . So if you've done any React or React Native programming, this should be pretty familiar, but if not, I'll explain it. Basically what's going on here is there's a state object that lives inside the template, the layout node, and that has some arbitrary data bound to it. And basically, you can just manipulate that. You can set properties on it, and that's going to re-render the template with the new properties. I'm not actually using that state yet, so hang on, let's just run the app. Okay, so I deleted my outlet, so. Okay. So obviously this logic now won't do anything because I'm not referencing state anyway, but in my label, I'm going to change the text here from hello world to hello name, which was the name of the state variable that I've provided. There you go. So now that works. What other improvements could we make to the template? So it's not very good practice to use hard-coded strings. So ideally, we want that to be localizable. So I can change this into a variable. And there's a neat little feature built into the layout, which is direct access to your localizable.strings. So if I say strings, is it string or strings? I can't remember. If I say strings.hello. Okay, so it's telling me that I don't have a localized string called hello. Again, that check is done statically when it first renders the template, so I don't have to kind of find that out later. And if I go to my localizable.strings, I can just add hello in there now. And again, notice I didn't have to rebuild my app here. It dynamically loads the localizable strings the same way that it dynamically loads XML. It doesn't do that for images yet, unfortunately, but that'll be coming hopefully at some point. And this doesn't look that great when it's, it just says hello with nothing there now. So let's put in a default value for that. So this is where the power of using expressions rather than just kind of, ordinary like auto layout comes into effect. So I can say if name is empty, then use world. Otherwise, use name. And again, no recompilation necessary. It just evaluates that at runtime and understands what I mean. So I think that's pretty much all I had to show you here. Just to recap then. Okay, this is reset itself, of course. Okay, so what is layout? It's a drop-in replacement for nib files, really. Not so much for storyboards. There is some limited support for multiple view controllers, but for the moment, the idea is mainly that you use it to build a single screen at a time, so one screen per XML file. It's human-readable, diffable format, so I know that not everybody loves XML, but I think you'd all agree that that file is reasonably easy to understand, and that's much easier to work with in say, GitHub, using a git diff than it would be for a storyboard. You have the rapid update test cycle, so it's not WYSIWYG, but you can reload the simulator directly after making a change without having to recompile your app. And it offers limited runtime type safety, so it's not weakly typed, it's not JavaScript. If you try and use the wrong type somewhere, it's going to complain. And you get that complaint right away as soon as you load your template. It's not going to wait until you press a button before it crashes. It provides helpful error messages, and it doesn't actually crash at runtime. It's crash safe, so it always produces that red box error screen instead of a crash. And that happens even in production apps, although you can control how those errors are intercepted. So instead of showing the red box, you can maybe log the error internally and reload your template or something. Templates and parameters. So by templates, I mean that you can create, you can wrap any collection of views in its own XML file and load that as a template inside another XML file. So you have sort of arbitrarily granular code reuse. It's got built-in support for localization and accessibility, like font scaling, and you can do over-the-air updates. So you can download those XML files from a server if you want to. It works with your existing native code base. So this isn't React Native. You don't have to rewrite your app in JavaScript. You're still using Swift for all of your business logic. And it works with existing components. So there is some support for kind of extending views with additional properties, but any normal UI view should just work directly in XML. And at least to my mind, it meets the criteria we're looking for. So simple things are simple. If you want something with a left position of 10, you just write left equals 10. And complex things are possible as well. So you can have arbitrarily complex expressions that can reference multiple other views. If you're interested in finding out more about layout, the repository is there. The expression library, which is used internally, is also available from my own GitHub page. And that's my email address. Any questions? Thank you. Yes?
And what's the performance difference from the auto layout? So basically, is there any gain or lose? Or so it will work for some sophisticated layouts, or it's mostly for easy ones?
So I don't have good benchmarks on that yet. It's something I kind of want to measure, but it's a difficult thing to measure. Theoretically, it should be as good or better than auto layout because it doesn't have this recursive evaluation thing. So really, I guess the guarantee I'm making is that it's predictable and it's kind of linear performance. So you're not going to have a strange expression which takes 10 seconds to evaluate. But in terms of the performance, it is doing runtime code evaluation. So it could potentially be slower in some cases. We've used it in quite sophisticated layouts, and it seems to be fine. Yes?
How does it deal with size classes or?
That's a good question. So the question was, how does it deal with size classes? So I don't have support for size classes yet. It's something I want to add. But you can pass in any constant value you want, either using state or with constants which don't change. So potentially, if you need to have a view which adapts to different size classes, you could either use different XML files, or you could pass in a constant that represents the size class, and then just use that in your expressions. You could also do very simple things like say, if the view width is greater than 100, then do this, else do that. You saw I used a ternary expression before. So, yes?
I saw that you bounded the strings file. Can you bind to arbitrary files? Like if you have a style file, for example, with all of your colors?
Currently, it only supports binding to files if they're localizable strings. Sorry, the question was, can you bind to arbitrary files, not just localizable strings? So localizable strings have been special cased, basically. But you can pass in any values you want. So if you wanted to bind to a file, you would just load it yourself and then pass it in as state. Yes?
Now I used it with a view controller. Is it possible to just use a layout for a simple view, like UI view?
I was just using it for a view there, so that was a view controller loading a view. Sorry, that doesn't answer your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But you were subclassing the layout controller, right?
Right, I see what you mean. Okay, so the question is, can you use this for views, not just for view controllers? So yes, so layout view controller is kind of a special case tool that you use to get that red box interface with all the debugging. But there's a protocol which you can add to any view, which basically gives it the ability to load an XML file using the same syntax. So you can create a view which loads its content from an XML file, and then you can use that view normally in any other layout. You can either use it in an XML layout, or you can use it in a storyboard or whatever. Yes?
Can you composite views, like import or include layouts from components of separate views, like Android does with include?
Yeah, so the question there was, can you composite views? So can you mix together several XML files to build a single view? I'm wondering if I have, how much time have we got?
We have time.
Okay, I'll demonstrate it. Okay, so let's say that we wanted to, reuse part of this interface. So we'd move it into its own XML file. And I can just grab that. Okay, so I guess you probably wouldn't want to have the top like that. I know, I'll touch that in a minute. So now I can just reference that XML file from here. If I say template equals hello template. Okay, so this is actually a UI label. Okay, so now it's loading that label from another file. And I mean, that in itself is obviously not very useful, but you can make this more complicated. So if I wanted to say the, well, first of all, I can set the top at the call site rather than here, which probably makes more sense. So any properties you set at the import site will override the ones on the view that you're importing. And you can also pass in arbitrary parameters. So for example, I could say param I'm not 100% sure that will work because I'm reusing the same name. Okay, name, I was passing the literal string name rather than the variable name. Wow, I've managed to crash it. See, this is what happens when you ad-lib. Okay, so we'll just hardcode that for now. You get the idea. So your templates can they can contain an arbitrary set of views, they can have parameters, and then you can use that from another template. Okay. Yes?
Do you have anything that facilitates styling similar to, again, similar to every XML with a style file where you can say this size is a medium size, or these various things should be used throughout all the XML that I'm using?
Okay, so the question was, is there any support for sort of style sheets, like CSS style or the way that Android does styling? So there's no style sheets as such, but you can pass in constants to use for your styling. So in my view controller here, for example, I could say let's say I've got a commonly used size value. I can pass that in as a constant at this point. I've probably got the order wrong here. Okay, and then in my XML, I can just reference that value. So I can say, instead of hard coding this gap to 20, I can say that that was medium. So it's not quite the same as a style sheet because you still have to apply the properties. I'm looking into whether something like CSS would make sense here. But this does allow you to basically avoid using magic numbers. Yes?
I didn't catch if you said it earlier, but do you actually use this in production?
Yes, we do. So we're using this in our production app. We've been using it for a couple of months. It's been approved by Apple several times in that time. It's in 3 or 4 apps, I think, in the App Store now. Anyone else? Yes.
Future plans? So where this framework is going?
Oh, God, that's a good question. So, I mean, it's not done. Like, there's a lot more I can do with it, but it's now sort of finished in the sense that it's usable. So, I basically just want to keep on adding support for as much stuff as I can. So size classes, somebody mentioned, that's one of the things that's going to be upcoming. Yeah, possibly additional features like CSS support, support for loading image assets dynamically, that kind of stuff.
Any more questions? Yes. Okay.